Hey, everybody. We are on the clock, so I'm going to launch right into it. Muslims are in more danger from terrorism compared to non-Muslims around the world. Terrorism is a horror show. Everybody suffers from it. But the question is, among all the world, who has suffered the most, Muslims or everybody else? If we answer Muslims, which I will show that we should, then that means that the Muslim world has the greatest responsibility and the greatest need to address and solve the scourge of terrorism. That is what the judges are here to decide today. I've got 4 lines of argument. I may spread them out across multiple time frames because of the limited time. First, let's talk about casualties. Far more Muslims have lost their lives to Islamic terrorism. From the Global Terrorism Database, between 2004 and 2014, about half of the terrorist attacks and 60% of fatalities from terrorist attacks took place in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan alone, all of which are majority Muslim countries with 96% Muslim populations. Pakistan had nearly 13,000 incidents. Afghanistan had nearly 12,000. Between 2004 and 2013, the UK suffered 400 terrorist attacks, mostly in Northern Ireland, almost all of them non-lethal. The US suffered 131 attacks, fewer than 20 of which were lethal. France suffered 47 attacks, but in Iraq alone, there were 12,000 attacks, 8,000 of them were lethal. The U.S. government's National Counterterrorism Report in 2011 says, in cases where the religious affiliation of terrorist casualties could be determined, Muslims suffered between 82 and 97% of terrorism-related fatalities over the past 5 years. Line number 2, it is a hopeless fight. The limited but serious Islamic attacks on the West have brought the wrath of Western nations down upon the Islamic nations, turning them into war zones in a battle they can never win. There are wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Turkey, Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all claiming at least 1,000 deaths per year. All of them have links to Islamic nationalism and suffer from significant terrorism against civilians. The U.S. military alone is 36% of the budget of the entire planet's military defense. And that's just ours. Our allies around the world make that more than half, far more than that. Among Muslim nations, the only one anywhere in the top 20 is Saudi Arabia, and they're not usually involved in these conflicts because they're a staunch U.S. ally. The number of war zones in the West from Islamic radicalism, 0. There is terrorism, but there is no instability, no war, not the destruction of nations like we see in the Middle East. Line number 3, chaos in the Middle East. It has brought chaos to many Muslim countries and only minimal disruption to Western ones, both in terms of violence and radicalization and polarization of culture. The list of revolutions and insurrections and instability in the Muslim nation goes on and on and on. I noted all those wars above, and there are more rebel movements in pretty much every one of those nations. I'll save my 4th point for a further one and turn the time over to my opponent.
Thank you. Thank you. This is my first time doing a moderated debate. My first debate was self-moderated, so I'm a little new to the whole miking issue. It sounds like you've done a lot of research, and you've done good research. From what you've said, I can only agree with most of what you have said. What I would like to do is ask you to suspend your current research and definition of terror and terrorism and try to look at a broader view of what terrorism actually is. Terrorism has become a very politically charged word that has come to mean something contemporarily, which is a little bit less than what terrorism actually is. Terrorism goes a lot farther and is undertaken by a lot more people than what is currently acknowledged by the current media and governmental systems in the world. For example, religious terrorism has been going on since the onset of religion, since the beginning of time. People have been controlled through fear by religions since the beginning of history, and governments as well. Currently, media is one of the most guilty of fear-mongering and terrorism, or the terrorism that I'm speaking of, which I think we have to include within the definition of terrorism in order to be fair to the way the world is today. by engaging the framework of terrorism being only acts of violence within certain specific ranges, we're kind of throwing out the idea of what terrorism actually is, and that is fear and evoking a desired emotional response through fear. And it's not only through violence that this happens. And I'd like to point that out. Let's see. Just to point out one simple fact is that we are all, as a world, kind of exposed to this sort of fear mongering. I can't say outside of the U.S. that I've experienced it, but I can't believe that it wouldn't exist outside of the U.S. And I'd like to point out that 24% of the world population is Muslim. That leaves 76% of the world population being exposed to the type of terrorism I'm speaking about. I hope you can acknowledge the type of terrorism I'm talking about, as I've acknowledged the type of terrorism you're talking about, and hopefully we can continue this debate.
Let me bring up my fourth point, and then I'll address what you've said. So my fourth line of argument is that given the religion and the Muslim terrorism that we have today has become an international issue, an international fear for a lot of people in the West, and it has led to serious backlash against the Muslim world and the Muslim people. Not just, I covered the terms of the war and the destruction that the Western nations can bring against the Islamic nations, but I also want to talk about the cultural and social reputation of Islam as a religion. There are many movements within the United States and in other countries where the extreme right wing has decried all of Islam as evil people. We put travel bans on them. There's persecution going on against multiple individuals. The FBI reported that there were 257 incidents of anti-Muslim crimes in 2015, more than against any other religious group in the United States, despite the very small number of Muslims that actually live in the U.S. So it's a highly disproportional backlash that affects people even outside of those countries that are predominantly Muslim countries and impacts Muslims particularly. So that's my fourth point. Let's come back to your broader discussion, because I think that's important. I've got about a minute and a half. Now, I will say, I think that if you're judging this debate, you should look and see which of these kinds of definitions of topicality you think are most relevant. That's kind of for judges to decide. I think that we should use the most contemporary, the most pressing in world affairs under the current events, the one that people are talking about the most, and that's generally Islamic Jihad terrorism. I will acknowledge that there are other kinds of fear in the world, and there are other types of terrorism, such as those from the alt-right or extreme Hindu terrorism that happens in India. There are other instances, but it is not the one that is present on most people's mind. It's not what most people are afraid of. So we should deal with the terror that is most present on people's mind. And I think if we look around the media that we have today and what is on people's lips and what people talk about, Islamic terrorism meets that definition. So I think that's what we should talk about most. I'm open to discussing the others, but I'm really interested to see you compare the harms of these other kinds of terror or fear, who they affect exactly and how they affect them, if we really want to evaluate that. I'm going to stand by my position on this, but I'm, of course, open to discussing it with you. In the broader sense, I think fear is more powerful against the weak, and Islamic nations find themselves weak militarily, weak socially, and weak demographically. As you pointed out, they're outnumbered. So they perhaps have the most to fear and suffer the most from this kind of fear, both in their present life and in the broader sense. I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you. I have to agree. I do agree that the Islamics in the demographic are, well, I don't agree with that you think the Islamics in their demographic are smaller, except in compared to the entire rest of the world population. And that is the case with almost every religion. There is no one religion that is in a majority point of view. But I would like to point out that the exact broad definition of terrorism I'm talking about is what you pointed out. People are in fear of Muslims because of the terrorism that is perpetrated by the United States. People are in fear of Muslim extremism when, in fact, there are only a very small percentage of Muslims in the United States, which you also pointed out. And that is an example. And I think using the contemporary definition of terrorism, you are in fact forwarding the type of terrorism that is used most frequently in our world but is ignored. That terrorism is control, and that terrorism is divisiveness, and it's perpetrating us versus them tactic, which basically puts Muslims on the them side of the us versus them. But us being in the United States or us being in Europe don't necessarily affect the Muslims that are over in the other areas unless you're in the armed services. So what I'd like to point out is that as much as you're right that the type of terrorism that is most portrayed in contemporary media is just a part of the terrorism that is perpetrated against everyone in the world on a daily basis that we don't necessarily acknowledge or recognize. So I think that contemporarily, we can talk about the most accepted form of terrorism, but you are only falling into the framed argument that has been created for you. Essentially, that is just one small aspect of the terrorism that keeps us all in line, that keeps us all fighting one another. It's not only undertaken by the establishment. There are other types of terrorism that go on a daily basis. just to make things a little funny, you know, your sister might terrorize you as a child and pull your hair and push you and you know, put her finger in your face and say, "I'm not touching you." That is terrorism in itself too. But you know, I want to step away from that. Don't even come back to that. But anyway, you know what? I do acknowledge the terrorism that you're talking about, and I think the way in which you want to frame the argument.
So time has switched yet again. It's a brutal clock for sure. So I want to talk a little bit about that because, you know, I'm certainly not a person that advocates any violence against the Islamic world. I've had many Muslim friends. I think they're wonderful people. I think by and large, Muslims are peaceful, good, honest, honorable people. Unfortunately, their culture is suffering from a terrible, cataclysmic civil dispute where some people think that religious zealotry and a kind of pure ideology is what's essential for their souls, and they're willing to kill, maim, destroy, ruin the lives of their countrymen, their people, their fellow Muslims primarily, and anyone else who they think gets in their way. And as much as I don't want to advocate violence when you're met with violence, you have to resist it to some degree. And they are causing so much chaos and so much pain. They have brought all those other kinds of terror, the terror of smart bombs falling out of the sky, you can't see them coming, the terror of Western soldiers and their cyber warfare gear. Those things are terrifying to the Islamic world, and they're brought there by the attention and horror, unfortunately, of religious zealots who have a message to those who are despondent that turns them to violence and makes the rest of the world their enemy. And that's not most Islam. It's just a certain number of people causing an incredibly disproportionate amount of problems. And unfortunately, our bombs won't solve these problems. Ultimately, they have to be solved in the Muslim world because they are Muslim problems. We can try to help, we can offer some assistance. I think we need to stay out of it far more than we do because, again, we can't solve this problem. We can't make people change their minds. We can only try to defend ourselves, and in doing so, wreak terrible havoc due to our incredible power. I agree that there is wider terror in the world and there's fear, especially from the United States. We're one of the scariest countries on earth. We could destroy pretty much the entire planet if we lost our minds. And sometimes I feel like our current president may have done so. Yeah, he's not a man I entirely trust. And it makes for this whole world to be more fearful. But really right now, the people who are most afraid would be the Islamic world, because that is where that wrath will turn. Most likely, if it is unleashed, and I hope to God it never is. So there is a wider fear in the world, but I think we can say that Islamic terrorism currently is one of the if you is the piece of sand in the pearl that is agitating. It is the thing that is most causing hardship, heartache, and turmoil for a huge variety of reasons that I outlined. I'd still like to hear a little more about how this more general fear hurts people and who it hurts and why it would hurt others more than Muslims. Thank you.
Okay, I can go into that a little bit. I would like to point out first, though, that the Muslim extremism has been kind of overlaid onto the Islamic religion based on political factors. It's not really the Islamic religion that has brought on this Muslim terrorism necessarily, but political factors like us coming into the Middle East, other countries coming into the Middle East, basically the developing world or the developed world infringing on the underdeveloped world, and the people who are in control there not liking that. And basically they're using the tools to their advantage to basically use the people who are believers to fight a holy war when essentially they're fighting a political war, a area control war. And so I will point that out. Now, what I would like to point out is that the types of fears and the types of terror that go on in the world, I have a small list here, and I didn't do a lot of preparation, so I'm going to try and present this in the best way. In the media, for example, in the developed world, we have health scares. We have nuclear war scares. We have racial war scares. We have constant divide and conquer techniques going on with political partisanship. We have foreign threat scares, and above and beyond, we have terrorism scares. Now, these are the effects shown from our side of the world, and the media doesn't necessarily affect the world over there as much because, you know, they're third world countries. Nobody has cable for the most part. People do have internet to an extent, but you know, I can't even say for sure what they do have. But I do know for sure that in the developed world we are daily guided by fear. Honestly, in the world in general, I feel like humans in general are guided by their fears. They're guided by their desires, but secondly, they are driven by their fears. This type of terrorism I'm talking about can be used for the purpose of stabilization, destabilization, political gain, and economic gain. Some of the terrorism I'm talking about is corporate terrorism. Some of the terrorism I'm talking about is economic terrorism against the poor. Some of the terrorism I'm talking about is state-sanctioned terrorism through lobbies that are then, again, corporate terrorism. But I'll leave it there. It looks like I'm running out of time. I'm beginning to catch this. So.
Yep, nice work. Yeah, the clock is brutal. I think we're doing a pretty good job, all things considered, with it. Okay, so yeah, let me address that. Let me agree with you. I think this is a great discussion beyond the debate topic because we're getting at some issues, and you and I actually agree quite a bit on it. I agree that the religious wars, the jihad, is not really just about religion. I mean, my study of history has been that evil people, people with political ambitions and strange desires, will use whatever they can latch onto, be it religion, ideology, economic principles. It's amazing the things that people have used as justification for murder and bloodshed. And it's got nothing in particular to do with the religion. As I said, most Muslims are wonderful people. They read the same books that these crazy people do, but they come to entirely different conclusions, not necessarily because of what's the words, but what's in their hearts. That's what I believe. I think evil people use every means possible to create evil ends, and good people generally will find good in almost anything. So I agree with that. It's kind of neither here nor there for the debate, but I think it's important. However, in this case, we're talking about something that is latched on to the Muslim religion, and as a result, the turmoil is in the Muslim world, and that's what we're here to decide today. Who's suffering the most from this? And I think they are. That's pretty clear. I mean, my 4 lines pretty much gone. We've gone off on these other tangents, but my 4 strong claims about the number of people, that they're in a hopeless fight, that it's create chaos and war in their part of the world, and politicize them and marginalize them in the rest of the world. Now, let's talk a little bit about the health scares. I agree there are scares for health and war and nuclear war. I just talked about some of that, and terrorism. But we're here to discuss who is in more danger. And while fear, I suppose, poses some danger to us, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. But ultimately, the kinds of pain and suffering that these people are suffering is starvation, war, murder, mass executions, rape, not just rape, indentured slavery, people being sold as brides, people being beheaded, explosions that rip families apart. It's just horrible stuff. I think that counts as danger far more than our anxiousness about race wars or nuclear war or the like. There's lots of fear in the world. The media lives on it and loves it. It's how they make their money, is sensationalism. It's not always fear, but much of the time it is, because we pay attention to that stuff. I have some philosophical issues with that, and I think it's very real, but it is not as real as the 12,000 terror attacks in 1 year in Iraq, the 8,000 lethal incidents that they suffered just in that 1 year, and that continue to happen, and the utter chaos and destruction of such a beautiful, wonderful part of the world as the Middle East, with such a long.
Okay. I got most of that, and I think you did pretty good not noticing the clock. But I have to agree with you, but I must point out the distinction that you are making. You're again separating one type of terrorism, and I know that's the basis of your argument, because that's what you believe the debate is about. And I am attempting to redirect the argument to an extent, but I would like to point out that the level of danger that someone is having from terrorism is not based on the type of results they are expecting, but I think danger in the context of the question is, are you more in danger from terrorism? And when I say from terrorism, I'm saying from being exposed to terrorism, not necessarily from the results of terrorism. So just to reiterate my argument is that the entire world is in constant danger from terrorism. Though that danger may not always be life-threatening, the danger is still real, and it is still very pervasive. And as Muslims only make up 24% of the world, the amount of terrorism is held by non-Muslims more, maybe not life-threatening terrorism, but terrorism in general. I think if we continue much longer, we're probably just going to continue talking in circles. I definitely agree with your points and the argument that you're making, and I think you agree with the argument I'm making. And I think we can go ahead and finish this up. But I'm going to pass the mic to you in case there's anything you want to close with.
Sure, thank you. I agree. At this point, we've pretty much gone over the whole ground. So I'll just kind of make my plea to the judges. And then since I went first, you can make a final one if you like. I just want to say that, the topic, again, Muslims are in more danger from terrorism compared to non-Muslims around the world. I made my argument as to why I think understanding Islamic terrorism is the most important context to look at in this debate. And I think I've shown that danger in this case means real and present threat to loss of life and property, but mostly to loss of life and liberty. And that while fear is a significant weapon and something we'll have to worry about, it's not quite the same, really not the same at all as the kind of pain and suffering that people are afraid of when it comes to terrorism, and that people really do suffer. While in the West we have some measure of fear, it is not the kind of daily reality that the people in the Muslim world have to live with bombs coming out of the sky, American drones, jihadi car bombs, people who just hate you for whatever reason, for religious differences and different sects. It's a horror show. It affects the whole world, but it affects Muslims the worst. And I think I'll leave it at that and allow you to make a final statement.
Thank you. I will make a final statement. I will plead to the judges that I have made the case for the existence of terror outside of the contemporary terrorism that politically is so charged right now. I would like to point out that the importance of that lies in the fact that the contemporary terrorism that we're so concerned with is causing, through its concern, more trouble than it would cause if we were looking at terrorism on a broader scale. I would like to thank the judges. Again, this is my second debate, and I don't expect to win, but I hope everyone enjoyed this debate as much as I did, and I hope you have a great day.